The reforms following the Roman Empire's 3rd century crisis, the struggle to maintain its frontiers, imperial administrative changes, and the establishment of the Tetrarchy, along with the reign of an emperor for over 20 years before his voluntary retirement, are all credited with ending the crisis that allowed for the rebirth of a Roman Empire under a new organization. Scholars have also noted how this recovery paved the way for the period known as Late Antiquity. So how did the Roman Empire recover? Was Rome reborn into a new empire? And what is the relationship of this recovery to Late Antiquity? Let's dig in. The crisis of the 3rd century in the Roman Empire of the 50 years following the assassination of Alexander Severus had shown all too well the deficiencies of the imperial administration. The period saw the increased participation of the military in politics, including a lack of clear policy of succession for emperors, which, in turn, increased the need for larger military forces that decreased the labor workforce. The period also saw economic challenges, increased threats from foreign invasions along the frontiers of the empire, and the plague all contributed to the destabilizing of communities, leading to social turmoil and chaos, resulting in the splintering of the empire into 3 separate political entities. Despite the initiatives and achievements of Aurelian and Probus, effective measures were still needed to counter these defects and stabilize the empire. Emperor Diocletian, who is credited with ending the crisis and ensuring the future survival of the Roman Empire, would leave a lasting legacy that began a renewal of the Roman Empire, one, however, that looked very different from the Roman Empire that preceded it. It was these comprehensive reforms that set the stage for the period scholars label Late Antiquity. The period that characterizes Late Antiquity is one that is far too large to discuss in one sitting. Scholars have written a vast amount of literature on the subject, and the archaeological cultural material is just as vast. Although we will only reference this period in small quantities in this video, we do plan to return to this subject matter in more detail in the near future. In this episode, we will focus on Diocletian and his role in the Roman recovery. We will discuss how he was able to end the crisis and stabilize the empire, and why his reforms might be seen as the beginning of a new era for Rome, and how these changes set the stage for Late Antiquity. The early life of Diocletian is muddled by legends, rhetoric, inconsistencies of the sources, and the hostility of his adversaries. Therefore, what is known of his origins is somewhat patchwork and mixed with some speculation. Born on 22 December around the year 245 as Diocles, believed to be the son of either a former slave, of a wealthy senator, or a scribe, the young Diocles began his career by joining the military. The early years of his career saw Diocles rise through the ranks, where he eventually became part of the elite corps of the Illyrian army officers, which dominated the army and the empire during the middle decades of the 3rd century. During the 270s, he served as commander in Moesia on the Middle Danube. He accompanied Carausius on the Persian expedition of 283 as commander of the household cavalry as a key section of the imperial bodyguard, a position he retained under Numerian's leadership. It is not completely clear what part he played in the murder of Numerian. Once the crime was revealed, however, Aper, a Praetorian commander, was blamed and hauled before the full military assembly and accused of the crime. He hardly had a chance to defend himself, and Diocletian was subsequently acclaimed emperor in his place. Diocletian's first action was to dispose of Aper. However, the whole scenario looks suspiciously orchestrated, like many of the previous imperial successions of the past 50 years. If guilty of the conspiracy, Diocletian outmaneuvered Aper and successfully passed on the blame. Following these events, Diocletian's army was brought to the east to meet in battle with Carausius' army on the river Margus in late summer of 285. Carausius had the larger army, and during the battle he was gaining the upper hand. However, a number of Carausius officers held grudges against the emperor for seducing and molesting their wives. Fearful of what such a victory would mean for Carausius, he was struck down by one of his men before success was achieved. Thus Diocletian was victorious, and Carausius soldiers went over to Diocletian without opposition. This victory gave Diocletian undisputed control of the empire. Unlike his previous successors, Diocletian did not seek revenge on Carausius supporters, but rather sought reconciliation, retaining many of them in key positions in his own administration. Then in November 285, only 2 months later, he bestowed on one of his most trusted colleagues, Maximian, the title of Caesar and control of the western provinces. This move was surprising, but by appointing Maximian Caesar, Diocletian was free to deal with the problems of the Danube frontier undeterred by invasions across the Rhine. Then in April of 286, only 5 months later, Diocletian raised Maximian's rank to that of Augustus. This gave Rome 2 emperors co-ruling the empire. The strength of their relationship was maintained as Maximian respected Diocletian's seniority, allowing Diocletian to retain a veto on all major policy issues. They shared the consulship in 287, and imperial propaganda likened their respective roles to that of the gods, with Diocletian as Jupiter, the senior paternal figure, and Maximian as Hercules, his agent in ridding the world of evils. Diocletian also greatly elaborated the court ceremonial practices and set himself apart from ordinary life.
He was a very industrious and capable emperor, and the one who was first to introduce in the Roman Empire a practice more in keeping with royal usage than with Roman liberty, since he gave orders that he should be revered with prostration, though before him all emperors were simply greeted. He had his clothing and shoes decorated with gems, whereas previously the emperor's insignia comprised only the purple robe, and the rest of his dress was ordinary.
The divine parentage was designed to inspire respect and to distance the rulers of the world from ordinary mortals. It was designed to shore up dignity and to give himself a godlike aura in order to bring greater security by making assassination seem like sacrilege. Public appearances were carefully managed, and anyone approaching the imperial presence had to perform adoratio, meaning to kiss the hem of the emperor's robe. He went even further by celebrating a divine birthday each year on 21 July, though he stopped short of claiming to be a living god. The same exalted status and divine parentage were adopted by the other 3 members of the Tetrarchy. This image of the 4 rulers marked a dramatic change from the early emperors, who portrayed themselves simply as first among equals. Between the years 286 and 290, Diocletian campaigned on the Danube and eastern frontier, while Maximian engaged in similar operations in the west. Then in 288, the 2 emperors mounted a combined operation against the Alemanni, with Maximian advancing across the Rhine and Diocletian across the upper Danube. Scholars have noted that despite the appearance of successful campaigns between the years of 285 and 290, and the effectiveness of joint emperors, these years were not altogether without their troubles. One example is that of the commander of the Roman Northern Sea Fleet, who was able to seize control of Britain and subsequently pronounce himself emperor. Maximian campaigned against Carausius in 289 but was forced to retreat. Such events highlighted the fragile stability of the empire and the issue of succession which had characterized the instability of the empire the previous 50 years. The need for a more formal arrangement for an orderly succession was crucial to preserve the establishment of joint emperors. In an attempt to curb the issue of ascension, it was devised that each would appoint a junior ruler or Caesar to succeed them automatically upon their death or retirement. On 1 March 293, Maximian adopted his praetorian commander Julius Constantius as son and Caesar, while Diocletian conferred the same position on Galerius Maximianus. This new organization of leadership is known as the Tetrarchy. This system divided the empire between 2 emperors, the Augusti, and their junior colleagues as Caesars. The arranged marriages were used to bind together the families of the Tetrarchs. The Tetrarchs were more or less sovereign in their own lands, had their own imperial courts and armies. With the issue of succession established, focus turned to securing the frontiers of the empire to remove claimants to the empire. In the east, there was a new threat from Persia. The Narcissus had overthrown the 4-month reign of Bahram III in 293, and in 296 seized control of Armenia from the Roman client king Tiridates and advanced toward the Syrian capital Antioch. In an attempt to stop the advancement, Galerius moved against him but suffered a major defeat on the plains of northern Mesopotamia. Following Narses' victory in Egypt, Lucius Domitius Domitianus was emboldened and declared himself emperor in Egypt. This move only lasted 4 or 5 months, when he was either killed or died on December 297, and the obscure figure Aurelius Achilles took his place. Shortly after, Achilles was defeated and killed by Diocletian at Alexandria in 298. Meanwhile, Galerius was assembling reinforcements from the Danube armies, and within 9 months of his defeat by Narses, launched a surprise attack on the Persians in Armenia. This time, Galerius was victorious. The treaty that followed gave the Romans control over new territories along the upper Tigris and brought peace to this part of the empire for 40 years. While shoring up the frontiers in the east, Maximian and Constantius focused on the problem of the breakaway empire of Carausius. In the summer of 293, Constantius began recapturing territories along the southern side of the channel, and later that year, in a palace coup, Carausius was murdered by his treasurer Electus. However, rather than immediately campaigning to Britain, Constantius spent 3 years making preparations and enlarging his fleet. It was not until 297 that the campaign into Britain began, with Constantius sending his fleet off the coast of Kent, while his Praetorian commander landed another force near Winchester and marched toward London. The forces of Electus marched west to meet the invading army, but Electus was defeated and killed near Farum. The victory restored Britain to the Roman Empire. Although the greatest exterior threats to the stability of the Roman Empire were removed, there was still constant need for military action on one front or another. However, with the major military crisis on the frontier stabilized, Diocletian was able to focus his attention on domestic affairs. Scholars have noted that despite his securing of the frontiers, one of Diocletian's greatest contributions to the Roman Empire was his comprehensive reorganization of the imperial administration. The establishment of a 2-tier system with provinces grouped together in 12 large dioceses governed by vicars. In this system, provincial governors and vicars held no military responsibility, while the army was given a separate command structure which cross-cut provincial boundaries. The aim of this structure was to secure stability and ascension, while making rebellion and insurrection nearly impossible. Overall, the system worked well and was praised for the impartial laws and regulations, the safeguarding of taxpayers, and the promotion of a better class of men to rule the empire. However, not everyone benefited from this new structure. While Rome and its immediate surroundings were not heavily impacted, the primary losers were the inhabitants of Italy, who lost their tax-free status, while also being divided up into ordinary provinces. Additionally, the Senate lost much of its power, and were steadily squeezed out of provincial administration. Despite his rebuilding of the Senate House when it burned down in 285, by the end of Diocletian's reign, senators were permitted to govern only 2 greatly reduced provinces allocated to them by Augustus. Along with the decline of the importance of the Senate was the decline of the importance of Rome itself. Rome ceased to be a major imperial residence by the later 3rd century, as it was too distant from the frontier regions, which were of more importance to stability. Under the Tetrarchs, residences did take on the trappings of imperial capitals, Milan and Trier in the west, Thessalonica and Nicomedia in the east. Despite the success of his administrative reforms, the problem of finance and inflation remained a threat to the stability of the empire and an urgent problem that needed an overhaul. With the need for a larger army and a more elaborate bureaucracy, the empire's financial resources were put under growing pressure. Diocletian recognized that a modification to the taxation system and the reshaping of the economy were central to addressing his growing problem. Diocletian attempted to halt inflation by overhauling the tax system based on land measured by its likely productivity, while also minting new coins of higher quality. The collection of taxes was the responsibility of the Praetorian prefects on an annual basis. This essentially created the Roman Empire's annual budget. However, it was up to the officials to work out how much each province had to pay, since the land measured was not calculated in the same way in all provinces. This helped secure resources for the treasury and to some extent attempted to deal with rising inflation and unfairness in the previous system, which had been inflexible and unable to respond to changing situations with the high cost of war, the damage to land, and social dislocation. The whole process was probably carried out gradually, province by province. In an attempt to curb inflation, he issued an Edict of Maximum Prices, which sought to fix the maximum prices on wage levels and at which goods and services could be bought and sold. The details of the edict listed about 1,000 items and was backed by severe penalties, including execution. According to Lactantius, the edict failed since goods simply disappeared from the open market. Diocletian also issued an edict on currency in 301, attempting to revalue the coinage on a sound basis and establish a unified currency. The revaluation was based on the numis, a large bronze coin with a mixture of silver, to be used in public payments and also private transactions. At the upper end of the three-metal monetary scale, he also struck a gold coin and a silver coin. However, Diocletian's policy ultimately failed, as such attempts at controlling prices was practically unenforceable and prices continued to rise throughout his reign. His attempt to curb the issue of inflation never really came to fruition. Although Diocletian has been seen as a revolutionary in many ways, one of his more contentious reforms was his treatment of Christians. The Christian polemicist Lactantius described the character and reign of Diocletian in a less favorable manner.
An author of crimes and a deviser of evil, he ruined everything and could not even keep his hands from God.
This description of Diocletian was largely in part due to the persecutions that arose following the return to the worship of the traditional Roman gods. Many of the previous emperors of the 3rd century had promoted the worship of the sun as a unifying theme. However, in an attempt to return to the traditional religious practices in 297 or 298, Diocletian issued an order requiring all soldiers and administrators to sacrifice to the gods. Anyone who refused was forced to quit the service. From the outside, this seems like a fairly simple order, but by this time there was a large minority group within the army and the imperial administration who were Christians. For many Christians in such positions, this caused a dilemma between choosing their position or their belief in a singular god. Things worsened, and 6 years later, on 24 February 303, an edict was issued ordering the destruction of churches and scriptures throughout the empire, along with the punishment of leading Christians. Subsequent edicts were made that ordered the arrest and imprisonment of all Christian clergy, upon which their release was contingent on sacrifice to the traditional gods. Pushing the matter even further, a final edict in 304 commanded all Christians, both clergy and laity, to offer sacrifices on the punishment of death. It has been noted that these measures were enforced to varying degrees in different parts of the empire. Under Maximian and Constantius, the western provinces were hardly affected. However, under Diocletian and Galerius, in the eastern provinces, persecution was conducted on a much grander scale, and Christians who refused to recant were tortured and killed. Lactantius describes Galerius as more evil than all the evil men who ever lived. Despite some ancient writers placing the blame on Galerius, Diocletian cannot be completely absolved from the atrocities of the persecution. Having the ability to end the persecutions, he chose to let them continue. In April 304, when the last anti-Christian edict was issued, Diocletian was in poor health. The previous year, in November 303, Diocletian visited Rome for a grand triumphal celebration marking the beginning of his 20th year of rule. In December, he left for Ravenna, and during the journey he became ill. The emperor struggled on through the summer, finally collapsing in December at his palace in Nicomedia. The illness persuaded him to take the unprecedented step of abdicating. However, for the plan to work and keep the stability of the empire, it was essential for Maximian to also abdicate. The two senior emperors gave up office simultaneously on 1 May 305, Diocletian at Nicomedia and Maximian at Milan. Thus, Constantius and Galerius became the new senior emperors, while Maximinus Daia and Severus were appointed to take their place as junior colleagues in Caesar's. Thus, the Tetrarchy was initially maintained, with Diocletian retiring to the palace he built for himself at Salone, and Maximian to southern Italy. Despite Diocletian's permanent retirement, Maximian returned to power the following year. Diocletian only made one final public appearance, attending the conference of the emperors at Carnuntum on the Danube in November 308. There, Diocletian rejected the invitation to resume his position. Diocletian's final months were overshadowed by disappointment. During the summer of 311, his wife and daughter were expelled from the palace at Nicomedia and sent into exile by Maximus Die, while many of his statues were destroyed by Constantine as part of a purge directed against Maximian. Many of Diocletian's achievements disappeared and were called into question. Then sometime between 311 and 316, Diocletian died. The stability that he brought to the Roman Empire would fracture until Constantine regained sole rule in 324. Perhaps one of Diocletian's greatest achievements was his ability to bring stability to the Roman Empire through his long reign and the establishment of the Tetrarchy. This peace and system lasted 21 years until his voluntary and peaceful retirement. The 50 years prior to Diocletian had been chaos, with numerous emperors all fighting for legitimacy, with none able to maintain peace and stability. He was one of a few emperors to reign and die of natural causes in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Despite its initial success, the creation of the Tetrarchy did not survive without the guidance of Diocletian, and true stability did not return until Constantine defeated Licinius in 324. Once Constantine gained control, he distanced himself from the Tetrarchy and the anti-Christian reforms under Diocletian. The Roman Empire and Constantine's successful rule did, however, benefit from Diocletian's achievements. Despite the great division of forces in the civil wars that followed Diocletian's reign, the borders remained secure, largely to the soundness of the frontier defense system set in place by Diocletian. Such stability along the frontiers no doubt played a part in securing the reign of Constantine and his line for over half of the 4th century. More than a generation of crisis had driven home the lesson that an emperor's effective capital must be located according to strict military and strategic needs. The Tetrarchs had erected and embellished their own capitals close to the frontiers, and Constantine himself had ruled and defended the Rhine from the Trier. Building on this principle, Constantine recognized the unique position of the peninsula of Byzantium, allowing for control of the straits between the European and Asian continents. It was an optimal location for which the emperor could quickly reach the Danube and the Euphrates. Similar considerations were made with Diocletian's choice of Nicomedia. Thus, Constantine was able to benefit from lessons learned by his predecessors in establishing a new capital that was more defensible and situated along natural trading ports. The rituals of the court and public epiphany that were developed under Diocletian went even further in practice of the diadem, kissing of the robe, prostration, the gorgeous clockwork pageant of the palace ceremonial under Constantine. It might be thought that Constantine's adoption of Christianity would cause deep difficulties for the exalted emperor worship that was an integral part of the new state system. It did not. In deference to Christianity, he dropped the formal claim to divinity and no longer demanded the pagan act of sacrifice as part of the cult. But in every other way, he elevated the imperial figure to godlike proportions. He was set as universal monarch who had entered into alliance with the supreme god. The close, exclusive relationship which Diocletian had claimed with Jupiter, Constantine claimed with the God of Abraham. The bureaucratic transformation of the Roman government started under Diocletian was completed under Constantine. The departmentalization of the central government, which Diocletian had begun, was now given its definitive shape. Thus all legal matters, the drafting of laws and rescripts, legal advice, and the whole traffic of petitions and decisions to and from the emperor were now grouped under supreme legal minister. The whole civil administration down to governors and town councils was headed by several regional praetorian prefects, who now shed their formal military functions. Additionally, Diocletian's tax system and administrative reforms lasted with some modifications for centuries. Constantine was able to recreate a gold currency for widespread use. The taxation system implemented by Diocletian was used to lever the annual budget to raise the state's estimated needs. It was these measures that scholars have noted set the stage for what is known as Late Antiquity, a period that is designated as one that saw discontinuity in organization from the Roman Empire prior to Diocletian, while also maintaining cultural continuity with the empire that had operated for the past centuries. The reforms set by Diocletian, while not perfect, and used to various degrees by the emperors in the following centuries, are seen as the undercurrent of the Roman Empire during late antiquity.